Imagine standing in a completely dark room. A sickly green luminescence materializes out of the black, pulsing from within the jaw of a teenage girl. The light radiates from bone that is rotting inside her living body. This horrific decay was the silent shadow of the late Industrial Revolution. For the Victorian middle class, life was defined by a sudden explosion of magic-like conveniences, such as instant fire, roaring indoor heat, and personal timekeeping that elevated the standard of living almost overnight. But producing that sheer volume of new luxuries required a massive workforce. To maintain high profit margins, corporations needed to manufacture these items as cheaply as possible, creating a vacuum for disposable labor. To fill the factory floors, owners bypassed adult men and actively targeted society's most easily controlled demographics. They systematically hired desperate young women and toddlers. The everyday comforts that built the foundation of the modern home were entirely subsidized by the physical destruction of history's most vulnerable workers. Take this simple strike-anywhere match. Before this invention, starting a fire in a cold Victorian hearth was a tedious, difficult chore. The Bryant and May matchbox turned fire starting into a split-second convenience. This visualization illustrates the danger of the secret ingredient making these matches cheap and easy to ignite: white phosphorus. While highly profitable for the company, white phosphorus continuously emitted a heavy, highly toxic vapor at room temperature. The laborers tasked with dipping these matches were almost entirely young girls, many just 13 and 14 years old. Working 14-hour shifts for literal pennies, they stood barefoot in poorly ventilated rooms, breathing in those chemical fumes all day. Over time, the phosphorus vapor would enter the girls' bloodstreams through minor toothaches or infected gums. Once inside, it attacked the lower jaw, rotting the bone from the inside out. The necrotic bone would swell, cause agonizing pain, and quite literally glow in the dark, a condition medically termed phossy jaw. The tiny flame that brought instant warmth to Linden's wealthy households cost the factory girls their faces, leaving the survivors permanently disfigured and slowly starving. And once those roaring coal fires were lit, the resulting soot had to go somewhere. Victorian architecture featured incredibly narrow, twisting brick flues that constantly clogged with flammable creosote. To keep those chimneys clean, master sweeps effectively purchased orphans and impoverished children. They specifically sought out 3-year-old boys, chosen exclusively because their bodies were the only things small enough to fit inside the 12-inch pipes. These toddlers were forced to climb up the pitch-black shafts, violently scraping the brickwork. Often the hearths were still hot, or fires were intentionally lit beneath them to force the terrified children to climb faster. The bodily mutilation was severe. Constant inhalation crushed their lungs. Unnatural angles warped their growing bones, leaving them with severely malformed spines. The pristine, smoke-free air of the parlor was bought directly with the suffocated lungs and skeletal deformation of toddlers barely old enough to speak. Decades later, as the 20th century arrived, consumer demand shifted to a modern marvel, the wristwatch. Specifically, dials coated in a brilliant glow-in-the-dark paint, so soldiers and civilians could read the time at night. To paint the tiny, intricate numbers on these dials, watch companies hired hundreds of young women. The work required extreme precision, meaning the brush had to maintain a razor-sharp tip at all times. Supervisors instructed the women to use a technique called lip pointing, twirling the bristles between their lips to keep the point sharp. They were assured the luminescent paint, which contained radium, was completely safe to ingest. This diagram shows the fatal biological flaw. Chemically, the human body cannot tell the difference between radium and calcium. When the women swallowed tiny amounts of the paint day after day, their bodies treated the radioactive element exactly like the calcium found in a glass of milk. The radium was woven directly into their skeletal structures. The women were unknowingly building radioactive poison into their own jaws, femurs, and spines, permanently irradiating themselves from the inside out. The convenience of checking the time in the dark condemned these painters to an agonizing, unavoidable death as their bones literally crumbled beneath their skin. Examining the match girls, the chimney sweeps, and the radium painters reveals a consistent business logic. Industrial leaders of the era calculated profits based on the use of cheap, vulnerable bodies that were easily replaced when they broke. Corporate strategy viewed vulnerable human biology purely as an expendable resource. A worker's body was treated as just another piece of machinery, used to accelerate industrial output until it reached a biological breaking point. But the undeniable grotesqueness of the physical evidence, the glowing necrotic jawbones and the crumbling radioactive skeletons, made this exploitation impossible to hide. It was damage that polite society could no longer easily ignore. This biological proof of corporate negligence sparked massive strikes and intense public outrage. The visual horror of the injuries forced governments to finally step in and draft the first true workplace safety laws. The fundamental protections of the modern workplace, minimum age requirements, and the strictly enforced handling of toxic materials were never freely given. They were purchased with the blood and bone of a working class that paid for industrial progress with their lives.